So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Tracey Duffy. Tracey is the First Assistant Secretary of the Medical Devices and Product Quality Division in the Health Products Regulation Group in the Department of Health. That group comprises the Therapeutic Goods Administration and the Office of Drug Control. And Tracey's current responsibilities include medical device regulation, good manufacturing practice, medicines inspections, and laboratory testing. Tracey has held several leadership roles within the Department of Health, including private health insurance, medical indemnity insurance schemes, and the Office of Health Technology Assessment. And Tracey has also had private sector experience, including consultants and advisory roles. So I think Tracey is very well known to us. We are very pleased to have Tracey with us today, and welcome to you, Tracey. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Can I just confirm that you can hear me loud and clear?
We can hear you nicely, very loud and clear. Thank you.
Fabulous. And that someone's on standby to click through the PowerPoint for me.
We're just about to start that, Lorraine.
Okay. So I only have a few slides, and thank you for the opportunity to join with you today. I didn't think I'd make it because there were a whole heap of things leading up to today's meeting, and I thought, oh no, I don't want to be able to miss it, but I'm pleased to be with you today, and hopefully we'll be able to answer questions and give you an indication of the role that the TGA has been playing. And I will limit my notes and messages around medical devices only. As you know, TGA is probably supporting a whole range of other activities associated with COVID-19 across the organisation. So this presentation is only about medical devices. So first of all, I think from the TGA's perspective, what I've seen personally sitting in the role here at the TGA is an organisation that has really pulled out all stops to be flexible and nimble. Something that has surprised me and surprised a number of internal staff, that we can actually, when we put our minds to something, that we can actually achieve something together. We haven't done that in isolation, however. We've really stepped up to the challenge and been very collaboratively involved in a whole range of different conversations and activities throughout the past 2 months. And I think where we've focused our greatest emphasis, and the conversations that I've had with internal staff here at the TGA, is really focusing on the areas of greatest risk, and greatest risk from a different perspective than what we normally take. Sure, we take a very strong view about safety and performance from a consumer's perspective, but there is an added risk associated with COVID-19 in terms of the health system's response and the ability of the response to deal with something that is beyond our sort of known knowledge. So the risk appetite and what we place emphasis on has really shifted a little bit during this time. Inside the TGA, and what we've tried to encourage when we're dealing with external partners and stakeholders and those that we've come into contact with over the last 2 months, is to develop and, I guess, put forward our culture of being nimble. And we in the last few weeks, we've thought about how we could continue into the future with this approach. Obviously, we can't continue at the pace and the speed that we're currently doing things, but there are learnings and there are experiences that we'll take from this experience, and then work out which ones we can continue into the future. So there's been a really steep learning curve internally as well. So the 3 areas that I want to talk to you about and share some of the activities that we've been involved with relate to our response, our engagement, and keeping everything in check. So if I just go to the first slide, it has those 3 elements listed in lists. So under response, I'll talk a little bit about our time-limited exemptions, and we have 3 of those in place at the moment for medical devices. How we've gone about balancing up our expedited assessment process for certain medical devices related to COVID-19. The ability for us to respond and provide information through web updates and clarifications. Our devices information line and the significant expansion we've had to do with supporting all the people who have had inquiries over the last 2 months. And a really important factor that your members at the MTAA would be very much aware of is trying to keep business as usual assessments going whilst we're also directing our efforts towards COVID-19. Because we do have regulatory timeframes, we do understand that there are businesses wanting to get their assessments and their approvals in place. So that's a really important balance that we've had to make. In terms of engagement, our engagement has really stepped up on a daily basis with the federal government agencies, different task force and working groups, international regulators and our ongoing interaction with those. The states and territories, a lot of new stakeholders have emerged over the weeks and probably more to come. And engagement, I've also put new website pages under engagement because that's been a really key communication tool for us in being able to support stakeholders and sponsors throughout the COVID pandemic. And then I did want to touch on the third element was about keeping everything in check. So about our compliance activities, our post-market reviews, recalls, audits, inspections, the ongoing media scrutiny, which will increase and be constant, I think, over the coming weeks and months, and our ongoing supply monitoring that we're undertaking. So moving on to the next slide, which deals with our response. As I said, we've put in place 3 exemptions for medical devices. The first one relates to particular items that were early on in the COVID-19 response were required by the Australian Government Department of Health for the national stockpile purposes. And that exemption was related to devices that weren't already on the ARTG, but the exemption provided to bring into Australia quickly some of those supplies to kickstart the response. It's not for the general supply of those items to healthcare facilities or consumers. So that was the first start, I guess, of what this response might include. The National Medical Stockpile obviously has had a huge investment in it. Over $1 billion have gone into increasing Australia's supply of PPE and pharmaceuticals held in the stockpile. And whilst we don't assist in identifying how those supplies should be distributed, we do play a part in working collaboratively with the national stockpile managers in making sure that supplies can easily go into that stockpile. The second exemption is for COVID-19 tests, and this was put in place fairly early on as well, back on the 22nd of March, at the same time as the face masks and other articles exemption was put in place. That was to allow the rapid supply of COVID-19 diagnostic tests to be available to Australian accredited pathology laboratories. The reason that exemption was put in place was to a group of laboratories that we knew were already under NATA accreditation and already had certain regulatory requirements in place, and that they were well equipped to do some of the early testing or validation of these tests, whilst I guess the rest of the sector and the rest of the train of applications could start at a later date. So they had early access to not only pathology tests, but they also had access to point of care serology tests later on as they came about. So in practice, that emergency exemption has allowed the pathology laboratories to really respond at a local level, because the accredited laboratories are in states and territories, and they are connected with public hospitals and supported the jurisdiction's efforts to put in place testing regimes early on. And that has been applauded, I guess, worldwide in terms of our early and quick testing regime and ongoing percentage of tests that are continuing to be rolled out. In relation to other tests, both laboratory and point of care serology for ARTG inclusion, we have in place an expedited assessment process, and that is generally taking around 48 hours. Now, 48 hours is a short period of time, and we have significant staff pulled offline to do that, and they have been working every day over weekends and late in the night to meet those sort of timeframes. Obviously, given that particularly the serology tests, limited evidence available in how these antibody serology tests work and their most effective use, they were approved with a number of conditions placed on them. And the conditions related to ongoing evidence and information being provided after their inclusion in the ARTG, and that's on a monthly basis, that additional information, as well as validation of the tests when they're able to be, samples are able to be provided to the TGA. Those samples are being validated by the Doherty Institute to report on the sensitivity and specificity of those tests, and when in the cycle those tests are most useful. What we did know early on is that the serology point of care tests were not useful at the first stages of the infection, but they do play a part potentially later on as the antibodies build up in patients, and can be detected 2 or 3 weeks out from the initial infection. So where they play a part and how they play a part is still being worked through, including by the Commonwealth Government and states and territories. The ongoing evidence to support their performance, as I said, will continue over the life of those tests as long as they remain in the ARTG. In terms of the third exemption relates to the ventilators, and the ventilator exemption was put in place to allow domestically manufactured ventilators to be manufactured according to a particular specification. That specification was developed mainly through the work of Chief Scientist Alan Finkel, a group of ICU clinicians and specialists with the involvement of the TGA to ensure that there was a collaborative approach to that specification. The specification and the approach taken here in Australia for domestically manufactured ventilators that would not normally go through the ARTG inclusion process is something we've seen in other countries, most notably the UK. So they have a similar approach that they're taking over there. So those ventilators that are supplied under that exemption only applies to those manufactured in Australia, only supplied to Australian healthcare facilities, and only as a last resort during the COVID-19 pandemic if the health facility has exhausted all other ARTG approved ventilators. And the exemption's in place until, at this stage, January next year. The way that exemption works is that a declaration is made by the manufacturer that it meets the specification as well as the testing requirements that are outlined on our website. We have a ventilator expert working group which we've fired up again to help us with any tricky questions or areas where we don't have the sufficient expertise to help us review and understand excuse me, the declaration evidence that's provided to us, and also helps us move those applications along quite quickly rather than us just using our own internal clinicians and assessors to do that work. The other expedited assessment processes, I've spoken about the testing devices. We've also got expedited assessment processes for ventilators normally, the normal ventilation conformity assessment process, and also processes for disinfectants who wish to make claims regarding COVID-19. Some of those approvals here again have conditions placed on them, and we'll be following up as part of our post-market review work to ensure that those conditions are met. But it was really important that we do prioritise those COVID-19 devices, as well as balancing the ongoing work that we do here at the TGA with other applications we receive for ARTG inclusion. In terms of our response, you can see on the slide there that we've approved 19 ventilators through the expedited pathway, 19 COVID-19 lab tests, and 34 point-of-care serology tests. Every day that figure goes up, or could go down depending on any withdrawals that we might find, because what we've found through our post-market work is that some folks choose to withdraw or cancel their entry off the ARTG. So we're keeping a close eye on that. At the same time, we published on our website and made it very clear to sponsors that as well as an expedited approval process, on balance there would be an expedited recall process as well. So when any issue arises or there are things that come to our attention that require us to take action, we have a process in place that we can do it more swiftly than what we would normally do. So instead of allowing a significant number of days for responses, the response times have been significantly concertinaed into short turnaround timeframes for responses back to the TGA on items or issues that have been raised. And we've been very upfront and transparent about that balancing act between expedited assessment and expedited recall to ensure that things that aren't safe or performing as intended do have the relevant action taken as quickly as possible. For us to deliver on the exemptions and the expedited processes, we've had to move people around the organisation. In medical devices, we've kept our regular folks, so we haven't moved anyone from medical devices out into other areas, but certainly the TGA has deployed staff into other whole of government efforts or been seconded to the National Incident Room. We've been able to keep all of our staff here in medical devices, but provide advice and cooperation through teleconferences and video conferences where it's needed, as opposed to seconding staff out of our group. So that's been a really useful thing for us to do. We've moved people around, and we've also pulled additional staff in from other branches outside medical devices to increase our capacity and the folks we have available to answer phones, write website information, and to help out with any other activities that we're doing in response to COVID-19. We have seconded folks from our laboratories area to help with some of the work on face masks and testing requirements. We've got staff from other areas of the organisation who have come in and are now sitting with our medical devices staff so that we could continue our business as usual work as well as the COVID work simultaneously, as opposed to letting one slip or the other one outbalance the business as usual important work that we do. I'll move to the next slide, and it's titled Disinfectants. Our work with disinfectants has been twofold. The first part is to make sure that we're able to clarify the recent changes on how we regulate disinfectants, because Some of you may recall that we did make some regulatory changes, I think it was late last year, in relation to disinfectants. And so making sure that we were able to explain those to new sponsors, but also existing sponsors who were going through the changeover was really important. We also responded to the request about inquiries from the public and also from hospitals and the healthcare sector more broadly about which disinfectants is most effective or could be effective against COVID-19. It's for that reason we put in place a new permission, and that permission relates to claims being made on the label of disinfectants, the packaging in which the disinfectants are contained, any material in the package, and general advertising and disinfectants. It was found to be very important that people could quickly find and source and seek those types of disinfectants to get on with the job where disinfectants are required. The permitted claims still have to be assessed and approved by the TGA where there's sufficient evidence, but that's moving that process is moving quite quickly, and there are 14 disinfectants with specific claims on their labels that we've been approved in the last few weeks, and they're listed on our website. We might move to the next slide, and that's titled Engagement. Engagement has been a huge part of our response and has taken up a great deal of effort because we're dealing with a number of new stakeholders and new communication methods and ways that we communicate. And this is one of them where we would like to have joined you on the webinar by video conference so where I could see you and you could see me, but that's one of the challenges we have in terms of our communication abilities here at the TGA. So engagement, we've been involved in a number of task force working groups and committees, both nationally and internationally, to share information and to make sure we keep up to date. We're also on the working groups and task forces associated with ventilators, personal protective equipment, tests, freight, domestic manufacturing and ICU capability and capacity. So those task force and working groups meet weekly or twice a week. So significant effort in our engagement through those working groups and task forces. New government agencies involved in medical devices, such as Department of Industry, Department of Defence, Department of Agriculture. There's a whole range of different agencies who have suddenly become aware of medical devices and the regulation of medical devices. And so for the first 3 to 4 weeks, a lot of effort was put into providing information, briefing them and bringing them up to speed so that they could actually perform their roles as well. It's the same for state and territory governments. Spent a lot of time on the phone talking through with state and territory governments, particularly industry departments, about the regulation of medical devices and what needs to happen for domestic manufacture. And this will continue. We've had a number of requests from state governments to talk to them and give them a briefing and a 101 education session. So I think that will continue into the future. International regulators, we have fortnightly meetings where we're sharing information, particularly where one regulator becomes aware of any fraudulent activities or issues raised with COVID-19 devices. We've been able to quickly understand what that is and see whether or not it's happening here in Australia, put out information on our website and be able to, I guess, flag that as an issue going forward. State and territory governments, we've had to deal with the health departments, with the Department of Industries and the procurement areas. Sometimes all of those groups don't talk to each other. So we've found ourselves being the glue in the middle to bring them all in. That has been quite an enormous effort, sometimes tiring, but I think I can see the benefits coming through that process, and it will only be a benefit going forward as well. And then new stakeholders. We've had our long-standing sponsors and stakeholders, but so many new players to the market. And you'll see on that slide that we've had almost 3,000 new entries in the ARTG. And it's fair to say that a high number of those new entries are for new entrants, and their knowledge of regulatory requirements and what's required varies from nothing to quite significant and everything in between. So a lot of hand-holding and a lot of inquiries and emails on a daily basis. You can see the numbers on the screen there. And it's been a great effort by the team here to respond as quickly as they can, particularly given the pressure on us with time differences, so making sure we're dealing with the inquiries and telephone inquiries and so forth that come from WA as well. So we'll move on to the next slide, engagement. Here's just a bit of a snapshot of our website activity. Most of the information on our COVID-19 website can be sourced on our regular TGA medical devices website, but what we found and which we identified early was that we needed to change the language and be able to explain in a layperson's terms what the technical and the regulatory requirements were. So we spent effort in refocusing and turning things around and providing it on a new website, packaging it up differently, and also including in that website information responses to the inquiries we received as the weeks went on. And that information continues to be updated as more information comes in and we get more inquiries, so that we're able to provide a one-stop shop where possible for people to find information. And there's now 29 documents there published for medical devices, and that number will continue to go up, or those existing documents will continue to be amended. And what I mean by responding to inquiries, I mean, one example is what we term in regulatory speak, reprocessing of masks is one example. Now, hardly anyone out there in layman's terms know what reprocessing of masks mean, but the inquiries we were getting were, can I use my mask again? So we've tried to use the language and reflect back to the inquirers as part of our website updates. What are the questions that people are asking? What is the language they use? And can we break through that technical jargon to make it more accessible? And that's quite tricky in some cases because the technical regulatory requirements are pretty straight. We can't mess with those. So being able to describe them in a way and provide examples is what we've hoped to achieve by using our website in the way that we have. We've also had to provide information about areas of non-regulation. And this is really important and really tricky because normally we don't do this as a regulator. We stick to the areas that we do regulate. But for COVID-19, many of the inquiries we were getting were about things that we didn't regulate, but we were asking our opinion or advice or views on. So it was important that we also put some of that information on the website, particularly where there were safety concerns or issues that people needed to be aware of when they were using devices in a particular way or in a particular setting that were either outside the intended use that was stated by the manufacturer or in fact aren't regulated by us. And the good example here is trying to explain to people the difference between a medical mask and a mask that someone might buy from Bunnings, and the differences between those and how you might go about ensuring you've got the right one for the right situation. So that's why information on our website is phrased and presented in a different way, and hopefully it's hitting the mark. Media inquiries, as I said, that will only step up, and we continue to receive those every day, many times a day. So a big shout out to the folks who have been supporting our engagement. To help with the drafting of layperson's terms, we did get some external support in to translate the technical and regulatory into layperson speak before we publish. So any feedback on the website information would be greatly appreciated. If I move on to the next slide, it's titled Keeping Everything in Check. This is just a snapshot of some of the focus areas that we've had front of mind when we're working in an environment that's fast-paced and has some expedited approval processes in place, as well as other, I guess, activities that might be occurring that go under the radar. So there's been an increase in compliance activities due to uninformed non-compliance, including those businesses trading in therapeutics for the first time and those seeking to take advantage of the pandemic. This isn't in Australia only, it's something that's happening globally, and I did refer to the International Regulators Forum teleconferences where we do share some of that information. Fraudulent certificates. So the US FDA for many weeks provided us with examples of fraudulent US FDA certificates, which we were able to use as part of our compliance activities, including our activities with Australian Border Force and also with others who are doing procurement in the states and territories. The question of the China export mark and the European Union CE certification mark came up excuse me, as an ongoing matter to be front of mind. It created quite a bit of confusion, and I think is still creating some confusion. With the China CE export mark, there's no registration, testing or auditing required in order to use the China export mark. It can be used arbitrarily by Chinese manufacturers, and the products, from what we understand, that bear that mark vary in quality from being acceptable to outright dangerous in their design, and therefore require constant vigilance on the end user's part to be safely used. We don't, in Australia, recognise the China export mark. Many of the other comparable regulators don't either. But to the naked eye, when you look at the two symbols on a piece of paper quickly, they do look very similar. So there have been quite a few applications put into the TGA with the China export mark being passed off as the European CE mark. The other area we've focused on is a number of letters which are having an immediate impact on compliance in most cases, and also the letters in relation to post-market reviews. So where we've flagged devices that are going to be the subject of post-market reviews, we have sent letters out. That has created activity already in terms of cancellations and a flurry of activity to get together evidence, samples, declarations of conformity, and we've been keeping a watching eye on that, and where that evidence isn't being provided, those entries are cancelled or applications are withdrawn fairly quickly as we make sure that we can maintain the balance between this expedited assessment pathway and the limited evidence that we require in those instances. The TGA has also started thinking about and planning for when the exemptions cease. We expect that there will be a bit of a clean-up activity in relation to the devices that are out there. So a condition of the approval for most devices, as you know, is to keep distribution and supply figures. For exemptions, we still have to be able to see where these devices are being supplied and make sure that we bring things back into the regulatory framework after the I guess epidemic and the response time sort of succeeds a bit. The point of care serology tests, quite a bit in the media recently about the validation work that's going on. The Doherty Institute, the Peter Doherty Institute's been engaged to help us with that validation work. We published their first report yesterday, which has their view on 2 of the serology point of care tests. They will be coming out on a regular basis as more and more samples are provided to the Doherty Institute, and that validation work continues. as I said, they have a place, these serology tests, and one of the difficulties the Doherty Institute has encountered is that because of the low numbers of patients with COVID-19, the ability to get samples from patients on an ongoing basis is diminishing. So their ability to test those tests at different intervals of time has been compromised a little bit. So, but we're working closely with the Doherty Institute to do that. Infringement notices, particularly advertising or false and misleading statements, have been issued. There's been some quite high-profile ones, including Mr. Pete Evans was the most recent one that was high-profile, and the other high-profile one was a company called Pro Medical, most recently, I think this week. Might move to the next page, and that's about QMS inspections. As you know, the majority of devices included in the ARTG are supported by QMS certificates from the European notified bodies, or you could use MTAA auditing organisations and comparable overseas regulator information to help with supporting your conformity assessment requirements. We have a number of activities that we're doing. We're still doing desktop audits. We have a program already that we're just continuing to roll out. The auditors have spent time closing audits already completed, so some tidy up work going on there. And we've also been involved with some of the MDSAP administration and governance arrangements, keeping in touch with MDSAP partners, understanding what the EU notified bodies are doing. We have done a small number of physical inspections where we've needed to, but we're also working on the premise that we need a number of ways of approaching inspections during the travel restrictions, and that includes remote or virtual inspections, a hybrid approach which might include a desktop review and an on-site inspection for particular things. As I said, we're doing small numbers of on-site inspections, but they are under specific conditions, and there's also the deferral of full inspections to a later date. And we'll probably have a bit of a backlog of those going forward, as will other regulators around the world. But we're not alone in that space. I can say the team have advised me that no conformity assessments have been delayed due to travel restrictions, and hopefully that will continue as the months roll on. The last slide I'll just touch on is our work with Border Force and the Joint Intelligence Group focused on compliance. And there's a picture there of one of the cargoes that came in that the medical devices staff have been doing joint inspections with Border Force, where we go out to the warehouses and go through the boxes. Some boxes, the majority of boxes have been fine. There's been some interesting finds in some of the boxes as well. And obviously those are referred to our compliance area. Our compliance area has around 300 open cases in relation to medical devices, so we haven't been sitting on our hands in relation to compliance activities. And I think that the formal investigations that are taking place with the help of the AFP, AUSTRAC, Home Affairs, ASIC, a whole range of groups on some medical device supplies are going to result in some interesting findings. But I'll leave it there, and I understand that George is now going to facilitate some questions.
Yes, I am. Tracey, thanks very much. I trust you can hear me at this point.
Yes.
I think that was very clear and thorough, and greatly appreciated. There have been quite a few questions coming in, and I hopefully will be able to handle as many as we can of those. I might start at the beginning. The first question was reuse of exam gloves. If a manufacturer of exam gloves intended for single use has developed and validated a protocol for gloves to be reused. Is a new ARTG required, given it's now reusable, so a different GMDN and intended purpose, or can a COVID-19 exemption be given for reuse provided there's supporting data under the existing ARTG, and would you need to review the data, or is it self-declared?
So I'll start off with how the emergency exemptions work first, and then I might defer to one of my colleagues for the specific around gloves and reuse of gloves. So the emergency exemption provision in the Therapeutic Goods Act can only be used in emergency situations for a kind of device. So you can't have specific subcomponents of particular devices that you could have an exemption in place for, and it would only be for emergency situations. Now, we are working on publishing information on our website about reprocessing in general. We've focused on reprocessing of face masks, but I'm looking towards the team as to whether or not that extends to gloves, because that hasn't come across our radar to date. I can't actually answer the question right now, but I'll take that on notice and provide some information.
Sounds like a Senate inquiry. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's good. Now, of the 19 ventilators that were approved, were they all based on existing designs by a new manufacturer, or were they new designs?
So I'll ask Dr. Simon Singer to answer that, because he's got some more knowledge. From my understanding, they are existing manufacturers.
That's correct, Tracey. So, George, just to confirm, the ventilators which have been approved to date since the COVID pandemic has struck have all been validated ventilators that have the necessary approvals by other jurisdictions that allow entry into the LTG, subject to our requirements.
So full assessment's been done, just in an expedited way. We've just spent around the clock time, effort, looking at the evidence and the applications.
Excellent. I had a quick question too, but I've seen several significant instances of TGA serving quite hefty infringement notices on companies related to possibly spurious advertising claims, and even an individual being fined. What does TGA intend to do in regard to incorrect and questionable or even fraudulent ARTG Class 1 self-declared applications? I understand that there's a lot of companies who probably don't understand the regulations, and that could be an excuse, but is it worthwhile advertising something that makes people think twice before doing something like that?
So two parts to my answer. One is we've tried to provide written information to new sponsors on what they need to have in place before they certify using the Class 1 process, and be very upfront and clear about what elements they do need to have ready, at the ready, if we call it in, including explaining what a declaration of conformity is. So we try on every occasion to provide that information up front, and we've got information on our website. The second part is that we are checking every night every single Class 1 entry that is added to the ARTG, and pulling aside those that we wish to ask for the sponsor to provide such evidence. And then thirdly, sorry, there are three things. And then thirdly, as part of our post-market review, there is a concerted focus in the first instance on masks, because that will be our first review, which we've kicked off on, including calling in samples to test the mask. And for the face masks, I think we sent out over 300 letters. 1,200 letters to new ARTG inclusions to request the information. So it's fair to say that we're taking this seriously.
Very, very much so. Thanks for that. From Polo Gilbert Wright, thank you to the TGA during this pandemic. Question is, during this pandemic, we've seen a number of devices being approved in record time. What has the TGA learned from this pandemic, and how do you think this will change moving forward beyond COVID-19? And I guess that's in reference to TGA approving products quickly.
Yes, as I said at the start, there are a lot of learnings from the COVID-19 experience, and what we're going to be doing is thinking about what things can be carried forward that make sense and that are practical, and which things we obviously can't sustain because it has an impact on, one, our budget, but secondly, the amount of time and effort and burnout of staff working in this way for sustained periods of time. And that includes me. So I haven't had a day off really.
Or a night off, by the sound of it.
And yeah, so you've got a situation, and we're not the only ones. There are others, you know, on the front line as well, where you just can't sustain that level of effort. And whilst there are fees and charges associated with new applications, there is a lot more work that goes behind any expedited assessment process. So we've also put to one side a number of our normal work, which has been put on the back burner, not the assessment work obviously, but other work that we do has been put on the back burner. So it's fair to say that there are things that we will take forward. There are things that we could do differently based on our experience, and there are probably lessons learned in terms of the risk and balancing the risk and where you put your effort, and being more nimble and collaboratively involved in conversations. I think the interactions and the new partners that we've established through this process will only put us in better stance going forward.
Excellent. Sounds like we might be doing that politically as well. That's another hope. Two questions sort of linked, but almost opposite in a way. One is, given the current economic climate, will the TGA be reviewing the TGA application fees for this period to all COVID-19 medical devices? And the other one was, is TGA considering increasing their fees next year to make up for all of the extra work that was required this year?
So our fees and charges framework is based on a whole of government processes. So every year we look at our expenditure, our income and expenditure, and every year we have to provide that the outcome to government, along with a proposal of what to do, whether it's an increase or decrease in fees based on what our operating requirements will be. Because of the number of applications we've received in the last 2 months, we have increased our revenue, and because we've been smart in the way of pulling in staff onto medical devices work from other work that sort of went down a little bit, we've been able to balance not having to over-expend that additional income that's coming in. Where we land, it's yet to be seen, but certainly I've not seen any indication that we would deviate from our usual government processes of how we arrive at fees and charges for next financial year. But having said that, we probably won't know the financial implications for a few months.
Right. Thank you. Regarding the ventilators, there are certain consumables that need to be utilised with ventilators. Are they exempt also if they're supplied with the ventilators?
So using the ventilator exemption, it's only the ventilator itself that is exempt.
Okay. All right, that was clear. Does the post-market reviews by Peter Doherty Institute only apply for point-of-care serology tests or apply to nucleic acid tests as well?
So we've made it very clear that all of the point-of-care serology tests will be validated by the Peter Doherty Institute. We've made that very clear. we haven't made a condition on the other tests that they need validation by Peter Doherty. However, the contract does allow validation of COVID-19 tests overall.
Right. Okay. In regards to the devices that were not initially manufactured as medical devices but repurposed as face shields, for example, is there a clear application or procedure?
I'm not sure. Can you just repeat that question? Sorry.
Yes, devices that were not initially manufactured as medical devices but repurposed as face shields. Is there a specific application or procedure required for those? I imagine if they're claiming to be therapeutic goods, then you might have to go through the normal process.
Yeah, so if they're making claims, therapeutic claims, yes, they should come through the normal process. Now, we do have information on our website, and a good example I can think of is face shields or masks, the ones that you might buy from Bunnings, that in certain circumstances could be used, but not for a therapeutic setting. But we've clearly put out our website that if you are using medical devices or face or shields in that setting, there are risks associated with that. So whilst I'll go back to the example of where we've put information on our website about the regulated products and then also the non-regulated products, and creating some examples on our website to just highlight some of the risks, issues, or things that the user might need to be aware of.
Thank you. Here's a question that says, will TGA be able to provide guidance on how to manage supplied devices that were supplied solely for the pandemic use, post-exemption or post-COVID-19, if there is such a time?
How to manage supply?
Yes, I mean, I imagine we're talking about things that are now out in the general public, which no longer required because of COVID-19. What are we going to do to manage those? I guess it also comes down to what you were talking about, which is the requirement for people to plot distribution of goods as well, which might be quite hard in the public.
So for those devices where we have placed conditions on the entries, and we're mostly talking about the ventilators that are manufactured under the exemption, or some of the point of care serology tests, those that are a higher risk in our view, we've really tried to make sure that those conditions are based on understanding where the supply has actually occurred, and then part of our post-market activity would be then to have a forward plan about what to do about those. Whether they, in the ventilator case, we would expect that they either need to become a fully conformity assessed ventilator going down the track, or they be taken out of the market. So we're still having to, I guess, put that out publicly in terms of the forward plan for those devices that have come through that process.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask one more question before I hand back to Ian Burgess. That is, will TGA test or do post-market review on new entered thermometers for accuracy, particularly IR shoot and point type products?
It's a good question, and I think I'll have to take that on board internally. And can we respond to that out of session as well? Whether or not we've got the ability to test those. So until recently, we didn't have the ability to test face masks, but I went and bought a face mask tester. So I don't know what's involved in testing thermometers, so I have to take that on notice.
Certainly, okay. All right, well, Tracey, thank you very much for that. Thank you to you and your team, especially for putting aside so much time that you have, especially with the busy period that's ongoing at the moment. So at this point, I'd like to hand back to Ian Burgess to sum up and end this session. Ian.
Thanks, George. The host just needs to turn my video back on. But I'll start talking anyway. And just to reiterate George's thank you, Tracey. Engagement was a key theme in a number of your slides, and I'd just like to acknowledge and compliment you, Tracey. Through your leadership, you've been driving extensive engagements, communication and consultation by TGA. In a business as usual situation, but even more so during our COVID-19 response. So I acknowledge and thank you on behalf of our industry.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And if there are any other questions that have come through the webinar, we're also happy to answer those offline and provide those back to you. And it's been a great opportunity to share some of the things that we've been doing and to acknowledge the efforts of your members and the MTAA as well, because we've all been partners in this 2 months experience, and from what I've seen from some of your members, it's been, you know, rolling the sleeves up and getting on with the work to see how we can all contribute to the response that's needed.
It has been, and I've said in other forums, it has been a remarkable response by our industry and in collaboration with TGA and other parts of department and broader stakeholders, and it has been absolutely remarkable and inspiring in that sense. So thank you again, and I think we did pick up most questions. There may have been a couple that we missed and couldn't get to in time, and we'll ensure that we pass those through to you, Tracey, and we can get back to our attendees with those answers. Just before we wrap up, I'll just quickly mention our next webinar is coming up on the 28th of May. It's a little different, this one. It will be 2 excellent speakers who've been featured on TED and TEDx, and I'm sure that will be a fascinating discussion and a great opportunity to hear from 2 inspiring global leaders, leaders and business coaches. So to our members and non-members, those on this webinar, keep an eye out for that, and you can register on our website. So we're just right on time, so we'll bring it to a close, and I thank everyone for attending. Thank you again, Tracey, and your team for this presentation, and we look forward to engaging with you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheerio.